Okay, I want to clean this viewfinder component here now. This is all quite clean comparatively, so I'm not going to pull this completely apart. I'll just give you a quick look at that. Now the front and rear glass in this viewfinder are held in place with this little spring clip arrangement here, which is not very springy. It's prone to easily getting mutilated when you're trying to get them back in place. The front glass, it's easy to see how that's going to go, the flat face to the front. The rear glass, that's slightly domed. It's slightly convex on one side, more or less flat on the other. The more or less flat side goes to the rear. That's all you need to know. I'm not pulling those out, so I'm not going to have to put them back. Just going to clean these with a little bit of domestic glass cleaner on a cotton bud or Q-tip. Trying to get into the corners of the frame. It's always easier to judge how clean the inside surfaces are if you first clean the outside surfaces. I'll just peer through that now and see what it looks like. I was a bit free with the glass cleaner on when I was applying it, so there's a bit of moisture underneath the edges there, which is now choosing to come out. That looks fine. Of course, suppose you couldn't see any of that. Zoom back out. Alright, I've got that viewfinder clean to my satisfaction. And it's time to put it back on the camera body. I'll just check to make sure there's no dust or grit on there. I can see something sticky there. What's that? There's a line of something, almost like adhesive. Don't know where that sprung from. That's good. So the viewfinder. One last check to make sure there's no dust specks in there. That all looks good. And two tiny screws. Countersunk head screws. Checking that they're identical. These are satin chrome plated. They'll be brass. They'll mark fairly easily. One I can get down in here. One of these will be prettier than the other. We want the pretty one on the other side where it will be seen. And a screwdriver. I've got to hold my advance, my reset lever across slightly. That screw started. The angle of attack for the screwdriver is not particularly good, so got to be careful, otherwise it'll slip and make a mess. That looks good. And on this side, the angle of attack with your screwdriver is no better, possibly worse. But if I pull the rewind knob up, I can get at it a bit better. That's fine. Nip that up. Gets our viewfinder back in place. I'll just spin the film advance knob off the top of the camera. I'm going to apply a little bit of lubricant here, a bit of molybdenum paste in a couple of spots, just for good measure, and then clean and put the top cover back on. Right, I've got a little bit of molybdenum paste here. I'll just run some on that pointer for the frame counter, so it drops back over the ratchet position smoothly. I'll just put a touch. Oh, that lever's sort of sticking there. That's one of the levers that does the ratchet, and that sort of seemed a bit reluctant to fall back into place, so I'm just going to check that in a second, just to get that one, bit of lubricant on that one. I'll put the knob back on, so this is all being held down correctly, and check the action of that lever again. Yeah, that lower lever, that's a bit inclined to stick. I think it's bent down slightly at the end. Yep, I'm pretty confident of that. I'm just going to lift it slightly. And I'll check and see if that made a difference. Still binding, and it's still low. Alright, a little bit more attention might be required. Let's just hold that lock down. Pull that lever out where I can get at it, get under the end of it. No, I'm going to have to investigate further on that. Right, I've got that working correctly now. That lever was just slightly bent down so that it was catching on one of the divider washers, the spacers, and so it wasn't dropping back in as freely as it otherwise should have done. So I'm pleased to have that sorted out. And that means that that top cover can now go down into place. So first I'll give that a bit of a clean with a bit of naphtha, just to lift that dust. You can see quite a pronounced dust ring on there. That'll be dust. It also looks like it's probably oil. It's cleaning away. I'll go around these outside edges. That's all good. Top cover just goes on like that. It's held with a single screw. Just checking the action of the advance and rewind lever. Pop the advance knob back in place. Check the action, that appears to be good. That all looks good. So I'm going to tighten up the advance knob. So I've got a spanner to go on the flats of the shaft above the film take-up spool. Rotate this knob tightly anti-clockwise with your fingers. You don't need to put a tool on that. Then that knob will stay there. That's all good. So our film advance is all dealt with. Next task is to put our leather back on the base of the camera. I'll zoom out a bit for that. While I've got the base of the camera like this, I'll take the opportunity to put a tiny smear of grease down and around there. That's the bottom pivot for the sprocket. Not that it requires a lot of lubricant. There's a little pad of card that goes in there. And that stops any adhesive or anything running down onto that shaft. I'm just looking at the state of my leather, making sure that it's fit to go back on the camera. It's a bit curled up at the edge there and a bit hard looking from that glue, so I might scrape that off before I glue it back. Right, I just want to scrape back some of this adhesive. If it'll scrape, it looks a bit reluctant. It's got a bit of wet and dry sandpaper here. I'm just going to give that a light rub to knock back some of those loose fibres. That seems fine. And now I'll apply some adhesive to that. Let's just knock that rubbish off there. So, this leather would probably soak up the adhesive quite well because it's quite dry and fibrous looking, that surface. Make sure I've got good cover to the edges. You can see the colour of the leather change as the adhesive soaks into it. Just a bit shy at that end, I think. I'll just put a little drop there. Spread that out. That looks fine. Bring back the camera. Now I just check to make sure that this release button hole is nice and clear. If in doubt, if the leather's, particularly if the leather's a bit shrunken back, I take a bit of grease on a toothpick, just run it through the centre of that hole, which will stop it from sticking to the button, which is important if it's too tight and if you've been a bit free with the adhesive. So get this leather all back down in place. The leather's usually shrunken to some extent, so you've got to push it down firmly round that tripod boss. Checking it's all pushed down firmly around the body, that's good. And since I haven't splashed too much adhesive around, I haven't got any clean-up to do, which is always a bonus. But my next task will be to clean and put back the depth of field scale. So, again with the naphtha. This piece goes on there. Can you see? You can just see. You can usually tell that's got a bit of a crease across it. You can tell which way it fits because you can usually see the marks left by the texture of the leather. Just removing all this dried grease. There's always a certain amount of corrosion with these parts. That'll be from the leather, I would imagine, the chemicals and the tanning process for the leather. So if I remove all that verdigris and rubbish, we should be off to a flying start. It's a bit ingrained dirt there. Component number one. The spring, the wavy washer, which provides a bit of spring tension, and that's in a very good shape. Often these are a bit corroded. This one looks good, looks just like new with a bit of dirt on it. So if we get the bits of dirt off, it'll look just like new. You can see by the colour of that cotton bud there, and get it out of the bright light. It's got a bit of green on it. That's the verdigris. That's the corrosion products of the brass. Okay, assembly time. Take my wavy washer, apply a little bit of synthetic grease to that, just catching the high spots as much as anything else. Drop that into the groove on the scale ring, put that in place. take this piece, I'll just run a little bit of synthetic grease around the inside edge there. That should just pop in there. Line up the holes, which is easier said than done. And there we go. One screw in, very lightly. Make sure the holes are lined up, just using my tweezers to do that. That's started. Check that the dial revolves smoothly. Tighten those two screws up. That's our depth of field scale. It should revolve smoothly, it shouldn't be loose. That is pretty much the body of the camera dealt with. Now I've got to turn my attention to the shutter. And here it is. I have the plunger working quite well. We'll just remove that from the shutter for the moment. Take one screw out of the Kodak nameplate. That's quite tight. That was just my phone telling me something I don't want to know about, probably. I've got to undo this little, rotate this little lock here. And I'm using the tip of my tweezers, and they're a little bit delicate for that really. I can't be bothered going and finding the right tool, so I will find a stiffer pair of tweezers. Right, now I can rotate this to unlock it. It's sort of bayoneted on. Lift that ring off the front. Having a quick look at the general state of it, I can see sort of dried grease, nothing too awful looking. So I remove the shutter speed setting cam. You can see a little bit of grease and dirt on the back of that. Unhook the spring from the main lever. This piece is called the main lever. The shutter release. This little pawl here holds the shutter in the cocked position, and when you press the release it swings up and allows the main lever to move. So I'll remove the screw from that, the little countersunk screw. Remove that lever. Hold the shutter release down with my finger there. It swings this arm down out of the way and gives me access to a screw hole here, a screw head. That screw head holds the cable release socket to the shutter, which in this case has the plunger. This arm here I want out. Now there's a little spring tucked into the recess inside the body at this point. Here, I've just flicked that out while I was looking the other way. And lift that off and lift out the high speed spring, the 500th of a second speed spring, whereas in this case it's a 300th of a second speed spring. This lever, be careful not to damage that spring that's coming off it. That's part of it, it doesn't come loose. Our shutter release lever should come off now. There's a little arm on the bottom of it and there's a spring that acts against that arm. Be very careful with that, both of those pieces. You don't want to damage this at all or lose that spring. This little lever holds the shutter open on the T setting. It's held in this case by a screw, which in turn holds a little brass bush, and that brass bush holds and centres that lever. This other little lever here, which forms part of that mechanism, you can leave that in place unless it's sticky or some other obvious problem with it. You usually don't need to touch that. I'm just having a quick look. I'll hold back the lever that releases the pallets on the retard gear train. I'm just checking the action. Smooth enough. Seems fine. I'm not going to remove the speed train from the mechanism plate. You can certainly do that for cleaning, but it creates more problems than it fixes. There's no special reason to believe that there was a problem there. If it had been disturbed and put back in correctly, or as on a shutter I did recently, somebody had removed that train, pulled it to pieces, put it back with all its innards missing, and so it had to be replaced. But generally speaking, it can be cleaned and dealt with, left on the mechanism plate. Right, so I've removed the 3 screws from the back of the cover. That holds the mechanism plate here into the case. There's a retainer plate here that holds the diaphragm settings, the aperture in place. Now I can feel this now, this feels quite stiff to move. It's smooth in operation. I'm not seeing any distortion on those blades. So it's possible that a lot of the stiffness may just be dried grease between the setting ring and the body itself, but we shall see. The mechanism plate. This is an early shutter. As you can see, it has 3 blades, not 5. It works in much the same way as your more common 5-blade shutters. There's a blade actuating ring which is swung from the top here, and the blades pivot at a certain point. We'll deal with that next. First I need to deal with this part. Just looking at my scales, making sure. On some shutters you'll find that the position of the aperture scales are such that you cannot physically move this to the fully open position. Well, I want it fully open just because that's a handy place to put things back again, so I know where